Coming up on the live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, Edgar and I will get you all of your latest news and information from the state capitol and from Washington, D.C. with an in-depth analysis on how it impacts you. Today, we are talking about the Department of Education. What could a closure of the Department of Education look like in your school community? We've got two experts in the field to talk about that subject.
The ACSA Legislative Lunch Break starts now.
And it's a couple of minutes after 1 o'clock. We welcome you on a Wednesday to the live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, along with Dr. Edgar Zazweta, ACSA's Executive Director. I'm Naj Alikhan, ACSA's Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Welcome. Go ahead and jump into the chat today. Say hello and let us know where you're watching from. Edgar, I welcome, first off, after last week's live broadcast from the Superintendent Symposium.
Yeah, it's been quite a week, not to mention just because of all this stuff we're going to talk about and all the stuff that our folks especially are reacting to. I know we've been busy here this week. I know we had a great conference down in Monterey, spent a lot of time there with our superintendents, some great feedback. Always appreciate hearing from people who, I think we're talking to ourselves here sometimes. So when people tell us that they're watching and whatnot, that's kind of cool. And then I spent the first part of this week with our friends at CAPL, the California Association of Asian and Pacific Leaders in Education. They had a great conference in San Jose. Got to speak to our friends there, and they're doing some great work. That organization, they've only been around for a couple of years, and just the energy, the vibe, just the professional development that they were putting forward. So, and I was on my way to try to make it to our show here. I ran out of time, so I had to make a pit stop. I was like, okay, my house is closer than the office. I better get on, or Naj is going to be mad at me, right? Or Michael might be more mad at me than you, Naj. So
somebody's going to be.
Yes.
Yeah. Actually, folks, this is the first time I feel like I've seen Edgar since the Superintendent Symposium, and that's because it is. We've got two great guests on the show coming up. Edgar, I do want to, I swear this was like this common theme that I heard at Superintendent Symposium.
Well, I got to point out Jason's comment there, right? Like no matter what, Naj might not seem like a nice person here on video. He's nice in person. So if anyone sees him in the hallway, please go say hi to him.
Absolutely.
He'll only charge you a nominal amount for his
My 8x10 is worth something. Just go to eBay. It's worth something. I'm telling you. Like I was saying at Soup Symposium, I heard from a number of superintendents. They said we just are kind of always waiting for noon, 1 o'clock, like it was at the beginning of the pandemic, for what the governor was going to say to update us. This from NBC News, President Trump expected to sign an executive order today prohibiting transgender women from competing in women's sports. The administration, according to NBC News, will roll back the Biden administration's guidance on Title IX, a civil rights law that prevents sex-based discrimination in education programs and activities that receive federal funding. Trump's order will, according to those in this story, instead bar students assigned male at birth from participating in girls' and women's sports and using women's restrooms. Second, officials say, according to NBC, the administration will work with sports governing bodies, including the International Olympic Committee, to ensure the guidance is followed in non-educational settings. The guidance, they said, Edgar, will affect U.S. visa policies. I know, Edgar, we're still going through all of this, but just want to get your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, like, talk about having to take a step back, all the things we talk about, take a breath. Like, it's hard to keep up with all this, Naj. I mean, like, I think that the parallel that you made right now about the pandemic, about it felt like every single day there's a new rule, there's something new that the field is having to respond to. And I'll make one other parallel, and in a very different way, but maybe like those early days of the pandemic, I think that the emotion and the feeling that I'm getting from just being out in the field, talking to our members, but frankly, actually even talking to students around the state in different settings that I've had the opportunity to be in is fear, right? Like just this uncertainty is prevalent. And I think what you just talked about here, a new set of orders, these definitely seemed aimed at the LGBTQ, even more specifically at the transgender community. And like you said, we're digging into it, and we'll likely have more to say on this on ACSA's behalf. But I think the bottom line is that there's just a lot of fear in many of these communities about this whole feeling about, are my rights being targeted? Where do I go from here? On all of these issues, I will say, you know, at first glance, without me having dug in and read the executive order, these are all things, the bathroom, the transgender youth in sports, these are things that have already been grappled with at a state and local level. I mean, and it's always not perfect. And I think we'd be the first to acknowledge that there's a lot of feelings on these issues. But the fact of the matter is, we have tried to go in directions to take all those perspectives. Far-reaching action like this from the federal government, it's going to have unintended consequences. Yeah. It's going to have negative impacts on students and kids in many of these instances, and something that we're very, very concerned with. And I think it's another reminder that there's so many targets right now. There's so many places where we have to focus on. But I think we're motivated as ever to try to just provide some support, obviously to our communities, to the students, and to our leaders on just how they're going to have to navigate this new space that we're in.
Yeah. Well said, Edgar. So it went public yesterday. An executive order is imminent that the Trump administration will move to shut down the Department of Education. It's going to be our topic today. We must remind you that shutting down the department would need congressional approval, but there are ways to diminish or minimize the department. Speaking during a news conference yesterday, the president appears ready to send public education back to the states.
We're ranked #1 in cost per pupil. So we spend more per pupil than any other country in the world, and we're ranked at the bottom of the list. We're ranked very badly. And what I want to do is let the states run schools. I believe strongly in school choice, but in addition to that, I want the states to run schools.
And the president has made a lot of campaign promises. Everyone running for political office campaigns on different platforms. Closing the Department of Education has been one of his campaign messages for some time. Here's what the president said in September 2023.
One other thing I'll be doing very early in the administration is closing up the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., and sending all education and education work and needs back to the states. We want them to run the education of our children because they'll do a much better job of it. You can't do worse.
All right. Edgar, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to comment on that before we bring in our guests.
Well, I mean, the one thing, you know, I was one where during the campaign, many things got thrown out by our now president. And I was the first to be like, yeah, maybe that's just narrative. You know, how much of this is actually going to turn into policy? The one thing that's clear, most of the things that he said in the campaign, he's trying to do them for better, for worse, right? So I think we need to take all the words seriously. I think my reaction to some of the things that were said is obviously that there's some inherent inconsistencies, I would say, even just the issue we were just talking about now, and then him saying putting power back into the locals, into the states. So yeah, this is going to be an interesting terrain we're about to engage in. So I'm looking forward to our conversation here.
Yeah, let's go ahead and bring in our first guest today. Jon Valant is the director of the Brown Center on Education Policy, part of the Brookings Institute. Jon joins us here for the very first time on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Jon, it's great to have you here. What's your view on what the Trump administration has been talking about in the last 24 hours with regard to the Department of Education?
Thanks to both of you for having me, and thanks to your members for all the great work you're doing at what is a really wild time in our part of the world. So I would say, and actually first, if I could, I saw the president's comments there. And just to be clear, because this is a talking point that we hear quite a bit, it is not true that our school system is one of the lowest performing in the world. And in fact, if you look at international test score comparisons and you compare the US to other relatively wealthy countries, we're roughly middle of the pack in math. And then we're actually one of the highest scoring countries in both reading and in science. So sometimes we have a habit of making ourselves look and feel worse than we actually are. And that doesn't change the fact that our outcomes aren't good enough, and performance has been sliding in many regards, especially for the lowest performing students. But it's just not true that we have the worst education system in the world. Now, as far as what is in the news right now and what we might expect to happen, we're waiting on this executive order that relates to the U.S. Department of Education. We don't have it yet, so we don't know what exactly it's going to say, and what exactly it says is going to be really important. The early indications that we're getting from some reporting are that there may be a couple of parts to it. And one part will be a call for Congress to act to either shut down the department entirely or to shut down some of the offices and programs that are established in statute and that require Congress to do something. And the second part may be a call for the department to kind of look internally to try to squeeze itself to see how it can shrink its staff and where, how else it can kind of get smaller and do less. But there's a way of looking at that as there's an indication of some restraint there. There's an acknowledgement, it sounds like, that they actually do need Congress to shut down the department or to shut down these big programs that it administers or the big offices within the department. And where I think this is most likely headed, and I think this is sort of what we've seen from Elon Musk and his team, is there's going to be a push to shrink the size of the federal workforce in general, and then the staff of the department in particular. And then we'll see the elimination of some programs within the department that are not established by statute. And so some of those offices and programs are, some are not, and they can do some things, but they can't do everything. Mm-hmm. So I think big picture, I'm really waiting to see the actual text of this executive order to see if it calls for something like the dismantling of the department, or is it just calling for kind of a review to look into how we might trim it over the next 60 days or whatever it may be, which is actually more like what his recent executive orders have been. They've been more bark than bite in some ways.
John, thanks for helping us out with this conversation today. I know we were watching some of the interviews you've been in, and you've been making the point, one, that we've been trying to express to our members. And I think most of our educators know this, but I think there's even fear amongst parents and communities that about what if they went after the Department of Ed, or if they went after federal funding, what would the impact be, right? And so we know, generally speaking, that the amount of federal funds as it relates to our whole school budgets are small. But with that said, there is an impact. Schools rely on streams of funding like Title I heavily, right? So what would you say right now, is there's so much talk about what the impact could be aside from the department going away in terms of the bottom line to schools? What do you see as some of the potential impact of all of these conversations that are out there?
It's confusing, and I totally understand how people get tripped up on this. So the department actually is younger than some of the programs that the department administers. So we had Title I, we had IDEA, we had a lot of these programs before there was a U.S. Department of Education, which started around 1980. And part of the reason the department exists actually is to administer those programs that are established by law, they were established by Congress, signed into law by the president. And if in the kind of most extreme scenario when it comes to the U.S. Department of Education, if we were to actually just shut it down, if somehow the department were to literally close, which would require getting through a Senate filibuster. So you have to count to 60 somehow with votes to shut down the department, where there would be no Democratic support. So really, we're in a world that's not going to happen. But even if it did, shutting down the department does not eliminate those programs. Title I would still exist. IDEA would still exist, and all of those other programs would still exist. They would have to be administered someplace else. And now that would be a mess, and that would be terribly disruptive, and we might wonder why we're doing that. But those programs, they exist on their own. Now, as you said, federal funding in education is relatively small. Across the country, it's about 10% of total per pupil spending across the country, but it varies quite a bit from one place to the next. And so for some school districts and for some schools, losing out on those funds, on Title I funds, actually is a really big deal. Mm-hmm. And the place we're in right now that is really unfortunate and maddening is we have a lot, and I would imagine a lot of members who are watching this today, who are dealing with uncertainty for planning for the 2025-26 school year. Right. Where if you don't know if you're going to have access to all of those funds, that may affect your staffing plans. It might affect programmatic decisions. That is unfortunate. And when it comes to kind of what could happen with Title I funds, with other types of funding, there is the possibility that we would see something along the lines of the funding freeze that we saw kind of very momentarily, and then it was unfrozen, where this administration could play around with impoundment, where they're taking congressionally appropriated funds and just refusing to disperse it in the ways that they are obligated to disperse it. That is an unknown. I mean, we don't know how hard they'll push in that direction. We don't know what the court's response would be, but on the surface, it certainly does not look legal. And I think we can hopefully take some information from the fact that they unfroze those funds so quickly. So I'm hopeful that there won't be a terrible amount of disruption, but I'm also very sympathetic to school leaders who are dealing with this, and in particular are just sort of stuck in a place where they don't know exactly which funds will be available.
And I do want to remind our viewers, coming up in just a couple of minutes, we're going to have our interview with Roberto Rodriguez. Up until 3 weeks ago, he was the Assistant Secretary for Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education. And now, of course, he has shifted to a new career because of the switch in the administration. So you'll hear that interview coming up in just a couple of minutes. And folks, if you have questions for John, go ahead and put those into the chat. John, I want to go back to this. There's been this consistent message from the general public that we do not pour enough money into our public education. Like, we should be devoting more funding to our students. Does the closure of the Department of Education kind of run counter to what so many in the general public say we need to be doing more for students?
It's a great question. And if you look at spending on education as a share of our GDP, and you compare the US to other wealthy countries, basically where we are is we're about average when it comes to K-12 spending as a share of GDP. We're well above average when it comes to higher education spending, and we're well below average when it comes to early childhood spending. And that, I think, reflects in the types of education systems we have. I mean, for a long time, people have come to the US to use our higher education system. And for a long time, our early childhood system has really struggled. And you're right that there is a general sentiment among Americans that we should spend more on education and that it is a worthy investment. If you look at polling of late, it is moving in some directions that are a bit worrisome. Some of that has to do with the department explicitly. So if you look at approval polling on the U.S. Department of Education, it splits by party, and you see roughly 2/3 of Democrats kind of are generally supportive of what the department does, and about 2/3 of Republicans are they generally disapprove of what the department does. But the trend line that really worries me when it comes to public opinion is actually not about the department, but it's about U.S. public schools. And what we have seen in polling on what Americans feel about U.S. public schools is a nosedive among Republicans really since COVID and since the COVID shutdowns, where in some recent polls, I think from Gallup, if not Gallup, it's Pew, I think it's Gallup, it's about 15% of Republicans are saying that they have a good amount of confidence in U.S. public schools. And that is historically anomalous. I mean, that is way lower than it ever has been. And we're also seeing a much larger gap between how Democrats and Republicans feel about our public school system. And I think there's a bigger question there about how that ties in with other policy moves we've seen toward more private school choice, for example. But we are in this kind of tumultuous period when it comes to public opinion in schools.
John, a couple thoughts, questions here for me as we wrap up. Kyla Griffin asks, she's asking about tax dollars and budget projections that have gone into account. And, we've gotten a lot of these questions. I think the bottom line, maybe if I could try to just paraphrase, is that bottom line, what do you see as the impact if they move forward with some of the actions that at least are being talked about in the executive order of them shutting down the Department of Ed? What do you see as the most immediate impact to schools?
I think the most immediate impacts, if we see something like a shrinking of the department and we see an elimination of some programs, I think it's first, or maybe not first, but it'll be felt maybe most clearly in just its sort of customer service function. I mean, part of what the department does is it exists to help with compliance on federal grants and just to sort of be there and help people. And when you start to squeeze employees out of the department, it's going to be less effective at doing just the day-to-day things that it does. I think we'll feel that before we feel real impacts on students. Where I think we might feel impacts on students more directly, one is if we do end up going down this impoundment route where funds get held up by the executive branch, which I'm really hoping is not the path that we're on. And then two, and you started this at the top of the show, there's this separate set of executive actions and other things that are happening in government right now that feel very targeted, particularly around civil rights and the protections of some of our most vulnerable students. And I think it's important that we keep in mind that, and Edgar, I really appreciate your comments at the beginning of this, that there are kids who are hearing themselves talked about in adult conversations about politics. And whatever direction all of that goes when it comes to policy or when it comes to public opinion, these kids are in schools and they hear it, and there's real risk of harm. So I'm hopeful and I'm confident that the adults in schools are there to embrace those kids and to let them know that they're welcome and they're loved and they belong in our schools, because I think that is where we're going to feel a more direct impact kind of right away here than whatever starts to come when it comes to the department.
John Valant, director of the Brown Center on Education Policy in the Brookings Institute. John, it's been an honor to have you here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. We hope to have you back soon.
Yeah, my pleasure. Would love to.
Thanks, John. Edgar, I want to point out as we transition here, about an hour or so ago, we had an opportunity to interview Roberto Rodriguez. Now, he was, up until 3 weeks ago, the Assistant Secretary for Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education, was an Obama appointee. He gave us some insight, Edgar, and we're going to play the interview next. He's going to tell us a little bit about what the mood is like at the Department of Education and what all of this really means for the U.S. and public education moving forward. It's great to have you here. We appreciate you joining us so much. First, what's the mood right now with your former colleagues at the Department of Education, with you who played such a vital role in everything that was happening at the department? What's the mood for you and your colleagues that you speak with?
Well, Naj, thank you for having me today and for attending to this really important topic of the future of the Department of Education. You know, I would characterize the mood as very concerned, deeply concerned about the current state of what we're seeing from the administration with respect to its plans for the Department of Education and for its future. You know, we've been following closely the reports of a number of Department of Education staff being placed on leave. And we've been following the reports about a proposed executive order from President Trump that would seek to reorganize, diminish, or eliminate the Department of Education. We're not sure what direction that might go in, but it has us very concerned because the mission of the Department of Education to educate all of our children is so critically important. And the work to support our public education system in this country could not be more important at any other time that I can think of in our history. We're at a really important time for the future of student achievement. We're at a really important time for preparing our young people to compete and win in this new economy. And the mission of the Department of Education in that respect is more important than ever.
Let me ask you this, and it's probably a little bit more of a political analysis than anything else. But when it comes to these executive orders, I've heard so many of our educators say it's like we have to stand by at noon every day, just like when we were having the pandemic, because there's going to be some announcement or some news conference. You've been right in the thick of things before. Is it chaos? I mean, is it almost like the thriving of chaos, the let's throw a whole bunch of things at the wall and then let's see what sticks, but we are just so excited about the chaos that is being created by this administration?
Well, I'll say we are seeing things move at such a rapid pace by this new administration just over the past 2 weeks. And so I certainly think that it's catching quite a few folks off guard. I think that keeping up with the proposed plans and intention from this White House is certainly has us all spinning. I would not characterize the department's current work as chaos. I think that the staff, and I know many of the dedicated public career servants at the U.S. Department of Education who have devoted their careers, their lifetimes to executing the important mission of supporting student achievement and preparing our young people for success, upholding equal access to educational opportunity. That work continues. And I know that work continues diligently. It continues in a focused manner and effect. But certainly, I think our school districts, our state leaders, I think our colleges and universities are all watching closely and with bated breath on where this administration is going on education. I think they want to see a plan that puts America first and at the forefront of educational opportunity and advancement globally. And that plan needs to include a strong U.S. Department of Education. Dismantling or diminishing the department is only going to create chaos in the field, and it's only going to create more disruption. After so many leaders have been working for years to recover from the disruption that this pandemic brought. So we need more of a ambitious focus on education, not less important.
I want to ask you, because you talked about Title I, you talked about IDEA, you talked about supporting social emotional wellness for students.
Yes.
What do you say to the parents and to the students who are obviously positively impacted by federal funding that supports the programs that they need? What do you say to them that they fear that this administration may completely punt that funding, maybe move it to some other places, scrap the whole department so it's down to parts? What do you say to them as a career person in the Department of Education? What do you say to them?
Well, I think it's important that they know that they're informed about the role that the U.S. Department of Education plays and the role that it plays in supporting their local schools and supporting their school districts. At the federal level, the resources provided, for instance, in K-12 education is less than 10 cents on the dollar. So the vast majority of funding comes from local and state level sources. I'm not sure everyone knows that, right? And I think what we've seen from some of the proponents of these plans to dismantle the department is a narrative that says we should return education to the states or return education to the local government level. Education is already at the state and local level. Again, the authority is already there. But what the department does is provide critical management, critical support, critical coordination of resources and of dollars. It provides technical assistance around supporting student achievement on issues like helping to improve reading instruction or math instruction, support the efforts to make sure all of our students are attending school and we can move forward from this chronic absenteeism that we're seeing. Supports efforts around positive behavioral supports and interventions, supports the importance of delivering on all of the services that our students with disabilities are entitled to. So many more functions. So I think it's important that the public understand the role that the department plays, that the tremendously talented staff within that agency play every day as a partner to state and local leaders in helping to deliver a great public education for all students.
Let me ask you this final question. What brings you hope? is there somebody who's going to come save the day that's in a cape right now? Does Congress step in? What brings you hope that we're going to start seeing some things on the positive side, seeing all of the negative headlines that are out there right now?
Well, there's such urgency in moving forward, not backwards, to address the educational challenges that our system is facing today. To address many of the things that I spoke to earlier. My hope lies in the resolve, the commitment of our parents and our students to get about that work. My hope lies in their resolve to support their aspirations and their dreams through access to and success in a high quality public education, in their ability to go to college, and their ability to advance their skills and enter a global workforce. And so, I take a lot of hope from the voices of our communities, the voices of our students and our parents. I'm also hopeful that Congress will continue to do the important work on a bipartisan basis of safeguarding the Department of Education Organizational Act, the bill that was passed 45 years ago that authorized and created the Department of Education, and in the shared commitment that we have to having a federal agency who has a mission of educational success and of safeguarding access to education at its core. And one thing is clear: if we do not have a U.S. Department of Education, we don't have any federal agency, no single one agency with that work around education and access to education as its sole mission. And I worry that will compromise our ability as a country to compete and win the future.
That was Roberto Rodriguez, the former Assistant Secretary for Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education, was a member of the U.S. Department of Education 3 weeks ago, Edgar. You heard what he had to say about what's happening in D.C., what it's like to have a strong Department of Education, then hear about tearing it up and changing into something completely different. What did you take away from that?
Yeah, no, it was interesting to get Roberto's perspective. Like you said, he has a long history there, not only in the Department of Education, but I know it goes back to the Obama days, was a senior advisor for President Obama on education. So it's interesting getting the insider view, I think, and this almost relates a little bit back to what John was talking about, because I think when we're talking about dismantling these departments or any part of the federal government, I think the bottom line, and I know it's the bottom line that our members are asking about, is like, well, what is the impact to kids? What is the impact to our schools, right? And I think Roberto tried to speak about this and I think that's our biggest concern. It's not the institution. Well, yes, these are, longstanding institutions, that the policy to put them in place for very specific reasons. For us, it's what are going to be maybe the unintended consequences of that? Yeah. And I think Roberto talked about this quote unquote customer service piece. I think one of the things that frankly gives us the biggest concerns is what happens to some of the functions of the federal government that are aimed there to protect our communities. The Office of Civil Rights, when we're thinking about Title IX, when we're thinking about these pieces that are really geared to protecting the civil rights of students. I think those things that I think are top of mind for me as we're having this conversation.
Yeah, and there's a lot of political conversations. This one's certainly impactful. We do have an important guest coming your way next week. California Attorney General Rob Bonta will be our guest at our virtual ACSA Leadership Assembly. Now, our virtual leadership assembly is open to ACSA members, non-members, educators, my school communications family out there. We will be doing our level best to take some of your questions, if possible, during that time slot to ask the Attorney General, Rob Bonta, who again will be our guest. You can register now for ACSA's Leadership Assembly. That is next Thursday starting at 9 a.m. You can do that by visiting ACSA.org. Again, there you go. There's the promotion for that. Also want to let you guys know you can register now for our ACSA Equity Institute. That's March 12th through 14th in Berkeley. Join us for 2.5 days of workshops, discussions, and learning moments designed specifically for teams of principals and teachers, parent leaders, counselors, and central office administrators to deepen your explorations of how these pathways can lead us closer to our goals in pursuit of educational equity. Visit ACSA.org/professional-learning for more on Equity Institute and all of our professional development events and conferences. Folks, if you like what you've seen on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, we invite you to subscribe to us on YouTube or like us on Facebook. When you do, you will get instant alerts when we're about to come on with breaking news, which seems to be happening every single day, Edgar. And then you'll get reminders for our regularly scheduled Wednesday show. And if you have great stories happening in your schools and school district, we want to tell your stories as well. Send your news releases, your photos, your talking points to our EdCal editor, Michelle Carl at mcarl@axa.org. All right, so Rob Bonta next week at the ACSA Leadership Assembly. That should be a very interesting conversation, Edgar, because I know that the attorneys general are very vocal right now about some of the cabinet members and their Senate approval process.
Yeah, it couldn't come at better timing given all these conversations we're having. And I'm excited. And I love seeing Mary's comment there. That was exactly the reason we kept up at least one time a year this virtual leadership assembly. And frankly, we had the idea, why not like kind of open up the current ACSA? This is usually just for members that are in our governance teams and that are elected by the regions, but we really have expanded this and see this as an opportunity where we could, put some information out that's beneficial to the whole field. Whether you're an ACSA member or not, we do hope you become an ACSA member. And frankly, even some of our friends outside of our administrator community. So we're looking forward. This is our second year. I know we had a great response. We have a great lineup, not only focused on some of the issues we talked about today, but also getting to the heart of the matter also, that we know that this is having impacts on students, frankly, on our members, on the leaders. And so we're going to also have some of the pieces, which has been a through line for us this year on wellness and how people can take care of themselves as well. So obviously, in addition to getting hear from us and some ACSA updates and a lot of good information. So hopefully people will join us next week. I'm excited for it.
Very excited. Edgar and I will be co-hosting Leadership Assembly. We put a link there for you to register in our chat section. Again, open to everybody. ACSA members, non-ACSA members, educators, counselors, directors, school communicators. We invite you to register for that. And Edgar and I are back on the air next Wednesday with the next edition of our live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Have a great rest of the day and rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.